If I had a nickel for every time that a young man by the name of Brandon went missing on a dark rural road after making a mysterious phone call, I'd have 2 nickels and still no idea what happened to either of them. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. Shortly before 1 a.m. on Friday, August 9th, 2013, the Coke County Sheriff's Office received a 911 call reporting that a stranded vehicle was blocking Route 277 somewhere near Bronte, Texas. For local law enforcement, this was not an unusual kind of evening. People traveling along that desolate stretch of 2-lane highway have very few options for fueling up, with the only gas stations for 30 miles in either direction being in Bronte. Assuming that someone had just underestimated how far it would be before the next gas stop, the Sheriff's Office dispatched Chief Deputy Brandon Neal and Deputy Chris Fox to go out and locate the stranded vehicle, with Neal heading south while Fox made his way north. Moments later, around 1:10 a.m., Neal's headlights illuminated the reason for the call. A silver Ford F-150 sat on the shoulder, its front slightly across the white line. As he pulled over, he took notice that somebody else had just arrived coming from the opposite direction. That man identified himself as Kyle Lawson and informed the chief deputy that the pickup belonged to his 26-year-old brother Brandon. Kyle then told Neal that his brother had stepped away and was walking up the road, but that he was having trouble keeping contact with him due to poor reception. After a brief discussion, Coke County's Observer Enterprise newspaper explained on their Facebook page, Chief Deputy Neal checked the vehicle for signs of a struggle. Finding none and aware that he had seen nobody walking along the road as he traveled there from Bronte, he decided that he was going to go southwards and just drive down to the county line to see if he could find anybody. What Neal didn't know is that Kyle had not been entirely truthful with him. His brother was stranded, and he was having trouble keeping him on the phone, but he was not walking along the road. Instead, so far as Kyle knew, Brandon was extremely close by. So close that at one point he'd said, "I can see you, I'm right here." The problem was that Brandon had a warrant for possession with intent to distribute, and there was concern that if he were to reveal himself to Chief Deputy Neal, he would be arrested on the spot, even though the alleged offense had actually occurred several counties over just south of Fort Worth. For that reason, he chose to remain hidden nearby while Kyle talked the officer into leaving the area. Soon after, Kyle got back in his car and drove a short way up the road, where he told the San Angelo Standard-Times that he sat there for a good 30 to 45 minutes waiting for Brandon to emerge. He never did, so Kyle turned around and made his way back home, telling the Standard-Times that, at the time, I didn't feel like he was in any danger. So when he returned to the scene around 5 o'clock a.m. that morning, Kyle expected that his brother would just be hanging out somewhere near his truck. Instead, Brandon was nowhere to be found, and any calls made to his phone number went straight to voicemail. Suddenly, the situation was very different. Just hours earlier, Brandon had been telling Kyle that he was close enough to see him, and that he was just waiting on this deputy to leave so that he could come out and get his truck handled. Now, he was nowhere to be found, his phone either dead or without service, with nothing but land and seasonally occupied houses between him and Bronte 4 miles to the north. And it was not the right season. What had seemed to be a simple matter of a man trying to stay out of sight now presented as a missing persons case, and it was about to get a lot more complicated. And you know what else can be complicated? Stopping your bad habits, which is why I'd like to introduce you to today's sponsor, Fume. Oh no, Fume. Fume's product is based upon a very simple premise. It is very difficult to break a habit. So, rather than trying to do so, why not just remove the bad from the bad habit? Let's take a bad habit, for example, where you inhale something, and you're out hanging out with your buddies at the bar, and then all of them start reaching for their bad habits, and you feel that pressure. Well, with Fume, you don't need to try and avoid being involved. Instead, you just take this little guy out, and you find that instead of, something with filaments or, fire, stuff you actually put into your lungs, you get this, and it's just steel, wood, and a little flavoring stick. No synthetics, no weird chemicals, just all natural ingredients. And one of my favorite things about it is that it's purely mechanical. There are no electronics involved. You just take this guy off, your flavoring stick is right here, it's just fiber soaked in oil, and then pop it back in here, you're good to go. And the fact that it's all mechanical stuff actually gives it a secondary function as a little bit of a fidget toy, because you can just, play with it a little bit. That twisting actually has a function. It controls this little dial at the back. This allows you to decide how much fume you want. So, if you would like to join the over 300,000 people who have given Fume a try, then you can go to tryfume.com/lorelodge, that is tryfum.com/lorelodge, and use our code LORELODGE to get in on this amazing Black Friday and Cyber Monday deal. Buy one journey pack, get the second for 70% off. Plus, Fume is giving away 5 gold-plated Fumes to 5 lucky customers. Imagine owning a limited edition, gold-plated version of this amazing device. Talk about a showpiece. And once again, head over to tryfume.com/lorelodge or scan the QR code on your screen and use code LORELODGE at checkout. Brandon Lawson and his girlfriend Ledessa Lofton had been together for so long that the state of Texas considered them legally married, despite the fact that they had never obtained a license nor had a ceremony performed. The couple had been together since high school, and in the preceding 10 years, they had become parents to 4 children. Brandon had moved the family to San Angelo about a year prior to his disappearance in order to work at Renegade Oil Services, where his brother was both a colleague and his closest friend. Due to the demanding hours of the oil industry and a lack of other connections in the area, the 2 Lawson families, far from their parents' home up in Fort Worth, lived in close proximity to one another, so it made sense that when Brandon and Ledessa got into a fight on the night of Thursday, August 8th, 2013, Kyle was one of the first people to know. As everyone would come to learn, that argument between Brandon and Ledessa resulted in Brandon calling his father Brad around 11:30 and saying that he planned to drive out to their home in Crowley, between 3 and 4 hours away. According to Ledessa in an interview on the Monday with Orion podcast, Brandon left the house at 11:53 p.m., so he would have been expected at his parents' between 3 and 4 a.m. It's likely that Brandon only intended to stay with his parents for the weekend, as Brad told the San Angelo Standard-Times that his elder son was scheduled to begin a new job on Monday, which came with higher pay and better benefits than he had been receiving before. He was less than an hour into that trip when, according to Ledessa, Brandon called Kyle at 12:38 a.m. on August 9th and told his younger brother that he'd run out of gas while heading north on Route 277, and that he needed a gas can brought out so that he could get to the nearest station. Kyle reportedly called Ledessa, who told Monday with Orion that she left the gas can out on the porch before she went back inside to go to bed. Shortly after that, Kyle, with his wife and 4-year-old son along for the ride, picked them up and made their way over to a gas station in San Angelo, only to learn that Kyle did not have the money in his account to pay for gas. Figuring that he could just pick Brandon up and take him to Bronte, where his brother could pay for the gas himself, he made his way out onto 277 and began looking for Brandon. It's unclear exactly how specific Brandon had been about his location, but it didn't take Kyle particularly long to find the truck. What Kyle didn't expect to see was a sheriff's deputy pulling up just after he did, which certainly complicated matters. While he would not come forward with this information until several days after Brandon had gone missing, Kyle eventually revealed to investigators that he'd been in contact with his brother from before he reached the pickup all the way up until just after he encountered Chief Deputy Neal. In fact, according to the San Angelo Standard-Times, there was an entire list of phone calls made by or to Brandon between 12:51 a.m. and 1:19 a.m. that night. The first 2, both at 12:51, were from Kyle to Brandon and Brandon to Ledessa, both of which went unanswered. A minute later, Kyle's wife or girlfriend, it's not totally clear what their relationship status was, but her name was Audrey, she called Brandon twice, and then Kyle called again 2 minutes later. It's unclear which, if any, of these calls connected. At 12:57, Brandon called his neighbor, Lori Norris, before calling his brother again at 12:58 and then again at 12:59. It seems that Brandon did not initially connect with Lori, or maybe their call had been cut off, because she proceeded to call him 3 times during those same 2 minutes. 10 minutes later at 1:09 a.m., Brandon called Kyle 3 more times, with Kyle reciprocating with 3 calls of his own at 1:12. Finally, at 1:15, Brandon called Kyle 2 more times, and then after that, his phone just started going straight to voicemail. And again, all of that is according to the San Angelo Standard-Times. There's unfortunately very little information out there regarding the details of these calls or which ones actually involved a conversation, but Kyle did share some information with the papers and the police. Of particular interest, he said that Brandon told him he was sitting somewhere close enough to see him, but also at one point that he was running through a field. And then ultimately the last thing that he said to Kyle and Audrey was that he was bleeding. This is odd because Kyle told the Standard Times that he didn't believe his brother to be in any danger at the time, when that series of claims would suggest that he was running away from someone or something, and him bleeding confirmed that he had been injured. The situation becomes even more confusing when it's factored in that Kyle reported that his brother had said something else to him during that initial call at 12:38. Specifically, he told Kyle that 3 expletives are chasing me out of town. Precisely what expletive he used is unclear, but he apparently confirmed to his brother that the people following him were the Mexicans in the neighborhood. Kyle found this odd because so far as he was aware, there were no Mexicans in their neighborhood. This prompted Kyle to ask Brandon if it was possible that he was hallucinating or if he was on any substances, only for Brandon to vehemently deny using any substances and insist that this was not in his head. Whether he was being chased or he had just imagined all of it, however, he was still very much in danger of getting lost or being attacked by wild animals. Why, then, would Kyle Lawson say that he didn't believe his brother was in any danger? It's actually not the only somewhat contradictory statement made by Brandon's brother regarding this case. The very same article from the Standard Times also reports that Kyle claimed he remained in the area for only 30 to 45 minutes before heading home. But Ledessa told Monday with Orion that he'd spent the entire night driving up and down Route 277 looking for her husband. What all of that means is hard to say, but it certainly seems peculiar that Kyle would not have recognized that his brother seemed to have bigger problems than potentially being arrested. And according to the local paper, the Observer Enterprise, Coke County law enforcement doesn't typically run plates and check for warrants when responding to stranded motorist calls. More than likely, they wrote in a Facebook post on August 13, 2013, Deputy Neal would have offered to help Lawson push the truck further onto the shoulder or told Lawson to turn his flashers on after finding out someone was on the way with gasoline. Sure, that is just a journalist's opinion, but in this case, the identity of that journalist is actually very relevant. You see, the Observer Enterprise is owned and operated by Melinda McCutcheon, the wife of then Coke County Sheriff Wayne McCutcheon. And that paper behaved very strangely during the investigation into Brandon's whereabouts. It did not take the Coke County Sheriff's Office very long to put 2 and 2 together regarding Brandon's criminal history. By the 13th, Melinda, again the sheriff's wife, was posting updates to the Observer Enterprise's Facebook page, and the very first one noted that, upon further investigation, it was determined the man had an outstanding warrant and had indicated on a phone call to a family member that he went into hiding upon seeing Chief Deputy Neal. To their credit, the sheriff's office did continue the search even after learning that the missing person had been deliberately avoiding an encounter with the police. On that very same morning of the 9th, Chief Deputy Neal had the pickup truck towed because it was partially blocking the road, and that was done around 8:30 a.m. The decision to tow the truck appears to have happened several hours before the tow truck actually got there, as Ledessa told Monday with Orion that Kyle texted her around 4:30 a.m. to tell her the car was being towed. It doesn't seem like a ton happened that day, aside from a wellness concern bulletin being put out to the neighboring counties, but by Saturday there were search teams on the ground. It seems that Deputy Neal spent most of Saturday searching the surrounding properties, once to see if there were any signs of disturbance, and then again with a thermal imaging camera. Unfortunately, neither Neal's efforts nor those of a small private team deployed from 8 a.m. to noon on the 11th uncovered any indication of where Brandon had gone. According to Neal's report, which I was unable to find online in full, but from which quotes have been published in the Standard Times, the only sign of anyone being in that area was a spot under a tree where it appeared someone sat down close to the roadway within eyesight of where Lawson's pickup broke down. For Neal, that seemed like evidence that Brandon had, as his brother claimed, been very close by and therefore most likely hiding from the police. Still, they were intent about finding this missing father of 4, and to that end, they called in the big guns, the Texas Rangers. Chief Deputy Neal met with Ranger Lieutenant Dwayne Goll on the 12th, and the two reportedly came to the conclusion that Lawson was possibly no longer in Coke County. Possibly is not certainly, however, so they requested a helicopter from the Department of Public Safety. The following day, Ranger Nick Hanna rode along in the chopper as they scanned the area from the Colorado River southwards along Route 277, but it was determined that Lawson was not on the ground due to the fact that there was a lot of exposed bare ground under the short mesquite and cedar bushes. Additional searches conducted via airplane had similar findings, with Neal clarifying that they were able to spot corn sacks from the air and, as he said, If you can see those from the plane, you can see someone laying down. So, citing the warrant, the fight with his wife, his choosing to hide from rescue on the night he disappeared, and the fact that there was no sign of a supposedly injured Brandon anywhere near his last location, Neal would ultimately conclude his report by saying that Brandon Lawson is not in Coke County, lost or hiding. In the intervening years, the Standard Times reports, Brandon's continued absence has strengthened Neal's views, which he explained were that, after Neal and Kyle had left the pickup truck, Lawson walked back to the roadway and was able to get a ride from a passing motorist. At the time, unlikely as this might seem, this appeared to be the only reasonable explanation. Except there's one thing that Neal doesn't seem to have been considering here. On Tuesday, the 13th of August 2013, investigators discovered that something had been missed on the night that Brandon went missing. He had called 911. In that call, he had said much the same as what Kyle went on to tell the police that his brother had told him that very night. Or at least so far as anyone can tell. And you'll understand when we show you the audio.
9/2013 0:50 and 38 seconds.
911 emergency.
Yes, I'm in the middle of the field. The Staple just pushed some guys over. Right here going towards Abilene on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. Got chasing to the woods. Please hurry.
Okay, now run that by me.
I'm not talking to him. I actually ran into him.
Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
Got the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance?
Yeah, no, I need the cops.
Okay. Is anybody hurt? Hello? Hello? Hello?
Since that call was released, a number of individuals and groups have attempted to transcribe the somewhat garbled, difficult to understand statements made by Brandon, but there are still several places where people just can't seem to agree on what was actually said. Generally, it's accepted that he told the operator that he was in the middle of a field, that his truck ran out of gas, that there was one car there potentially other than his truck, that they were going towards Abilene on both sides, that he'd run into someone and there would be no talking to them, and that he needed the cops rather than an ambulance. Perhaps most importantly, Brandon made that 911 call at 12:53 a.m., nearly a full 20 minutes before he allegedly told Kyle that he was sitting nearby, close enough to see both his brother and Deputy Neal. Immediately, that last aspect throws a massive wrench into the narrative that Brandon was hiding from the police, because he directly requested their assistance long before either his brother or the sheriff's department showed up. It simply does not follow that he would call them just to then hide from them. Clearly, at the time he made the 911 call, whatever he was dealing with, he was much more afraid of than he was going to jail. A sentiment that his father echoed to the Standard Times in 2018. Brandon had already done some state jail time, Brad told the paper, and Brandon wasn't afraid to take the punishment that was dealt to him. Sure, it could just be the words of a father standing by his son, but at the end of the day, the logic really just doesn't follow that he'd hide from the very same help he himself called for. As for why he called for help in the first place, that's a little bit more difficult to unravel, but it still points to something other than paranoia about being arrested. In that audio, it sounds very much like he said a stapler, or scaper either pushed or pulled some guys over, followed by, they're out here going towards Abilene on both sides. The Abilene part is very straightforward, except for the fact that the nearest turnoff to Abilene was over 12 miles north of where the pickup was located. Now, the city itself is approximately 50 miles northeast as the crow flies, so it is possible that Brandon simply meant that they were heading north, but who were they anyway? And also, what is that unintelligible word? And who was it that pushed or pulled them over? A lot of people have suggested that this unintelligible word is staper, which could be either a slang term or a misspoken attempt at saying the words state trooper. But there's no record of any state troopers being in that area at that time of night, and the call informing the sheriff about the stranded vehicle, the one that was not made by Brandon, didn't come in until 12:58 a.m., 5 minutes after Brandon's call. Additionally, if we're talking about a state trooper here, then the call would suggest that Brandon was calling for backup for that trooper, which makes no sense because the trooper would just call for backup himself using his radio. He wouldn't ask a random stranded motorist to call 911 for him. Another common suggestion is stapler, which, according to Urban Dictionary, was in fact a slang term among the theater community in Dallas during the early 2010s. The term meant stalker, and Dallas is essentially attached to Brandon's hometown of Fort Worth. It would also fit with Kyle's claim that Brandon said that he was being chased out of town by Mexicans from his neighborhood. But then the question is, why would somebody not involved with theater be using theater slang while calling 911? Lastly, there is scaper, which has appeared as slang for scapegoat, but in this circumstance that makes little sense. What does seem possible is that the guys who were pushed or pulled over are the same people that Brandon said he totally ran into just a few seconds later, which would suggest that whatever that word was, it actually applied to Brandon himself. The problem there is that Brandon's truck didn't have any reported damage, meaning that whoever he supposedly hit probably wasn't in a car, or that the pushing over happened after Brandon had left the vehicle. I actually do think there could be something to that, given that the reported position of the vehicle was not exactly consistent with somebody who just ran out of gas. Ledessa and the others said that the front end of the vehicle was jutting slightly into the travel lane, which would be more indicative of somebody trying to get back onto the road than someone trying to get off of it. Now, alternatively, he may have been saying scraper as it applies to a style of car modification popular in the Bay Area of California in the 1980s. This would make sense for the claim that the scraper, being a car, had just pushed some guys over, but not necessarily the claim that he totally ran into them, because if he totally ran into the scraper, you would think that there would be some damage. Regardless, he plainly stated that he was in the middle of a field, and it sounds quite a bit like he said that somebody was chasing him into the woods. All of that, combined with him sort of sounding almost like he's laughing when he's asked about needing an ambulance and then saying, "No, I need the cops," while actively having a warrant for his own arrest, would strongly suggest that somebody was trying to harm him. One way that this could all theoretically make sense is if Brandon was either followed from San Angelo or ambushed on 277, ended up on the shoulder, and then ran out of gas as he tried to make it back to the road. If someone had pulled up next to him, then it could explain the comment about being headed toward Abilene on both sides, and why he said there was one car there. Alternatively, it could be that there were people on both sides of the road as he was driving north, and that they jumped him after he ran out of gas. It's not perfect, and to be honest, I'm not sure that I even like it, but it at least wraps things together in a way that sorta makes sense. But what doesn't make sense is the fact that the sheriff's office apparently never responded to Brandon's 911 call. When the line went dead, instead of immediately calling him back or trying to ping the location of his phone, instead, the dispatcher waited a full 15 minutes to try and call back. And according to the Observer Enterprise, dispatch also failed to inform the sheriff's office that Brandon said he'd hit someone. But then again, the paper was being weird. For example, prior to August 13th, 2013, they didn't have a Facebook page. Upon creating one, the very first thing that Melinda McCutcheon did, again, that is the sheriff's wife, was post about Brandon's case. She then proceeded to post a full 3 more updates that day, and in the second one, she said that the original 911 call came to Coke County Sheriff's Office at 12:58 a.m. Friday, August 9th, 2013, reporting a stranded motorist. This, as she knew then and we know now, was not true. Brandon called 911 first, and it seems that others might have noticed this little bit of misinformation because on the 14th, the paper's Facebook page lit up with another post. This time, McCutcheon informed readers that, until the current situation has been resolved, the paper was asking for no more comments to any post concerning the Brandon Lawson story. She then clarified that the story will come out in the paper this week, and that article will be the last until there's a break in this case, and added that all comments posted so far have been removed. Demanding that your readers not ask questions and then deleting all comments on a story is unprofessional for any paper, but it's downright unacceptable for a paper that is for all intents and purposes owned by the sheriff. To make matters worse, the paper would go on to post yet another update on the 29th, in which they once again mentioned Brandon's warrants, but failed to include the detail that he had called 911 himself. All of this suggests a severe lack of objectivity, which was on full display in the 4th update posted on the 13th, wherein McCutcheon wrote, "I think if Brandon Lawson had not hidden from Deputy Neal, then a husband and father would not be missing tonight." In post after post after post, The wife of the sheriff in charge of this investigation layered blame and suspicion upon the missing individual, all while just sweeping the department's failure to respond to a frantic 911 call from the very man they couldn't find right under the rug. And it doesn't stop there either. As it turns out, the posts to the paper's official page were the publisher's idea of professionalism. Through her personal account, she posted a comment on a post by the Help Find Brandon Lawson Facebook page run by Ledessa and a friend of hers on the 13th of August. In it, she strangely pretended that she was not the one writing the post over at the Observer Enterprise, instead saying that the paper posted it. She posted another comment moments later, pondering the question, after the deputy left and in the hours before the truck was towed, why didn't Brandon go back to his truck and drive off? Could it be he thought he would be stopped while driving? His actions prove that he didn't want to be seen by law enforcement. Could it be he still doesn't want to be found, especially after all the publicity? Meanwhile, the Observer Enterprise posted at almost exactly the same time that the reports on the Help Find Brandon Lawson page are inaccurate, while encouraging their readers to share this latest report on that page to inform their members. Now keep in mind, the Observer Enterprise report was itself inaccurate. But in this case, the report she was referring to was one where the Help Find Brandon Lawson page said that the truck had been towed that same night, which was completely true. Technically, the truck was towed at 8:30 in the morning, but that was only 7 hours after it was found. I think it should also be pointed out here that no actual investigation of the truck was done. Deputy Neal said that he, checked to make sure there was nobody there. He got in, he turned on the blinker, and then he shut the doors and locked them and just left. That was it. That, by the way, was left out of the Observer Enterprise report. It really can't be understated how damaging to a missing persons case it is to have the wife of the lead investigator all over Facebook suggesting it was an intentional disappearance. But if Sheriff McCutcheon was aware of it, he did nothing to stop it. On December 22nd, 2013, Melinda McCutcheon commented on a public message board regarding the case. What many people don't realize, she wrote, is that 911 calls in Coke County are answered by nurses and staff at the local nursing home in Robert Lee. They then call the sheriff's office dispatcher. Believe it or not, that's not even the bad part. She went on to say, I interviewed the dispatcher for the sheriff's office that night and was told they were only told that a 911 call had come in from a stranded motorist who had run out of gas on Highway 277. They didn't state north or south, so deputies were sent in both directions. Now that's interesting. Back in August, and then again in October, Melinda was saying that Neal and Fox were responding to a call from a trucker. Yet here, in this instance, she quite clearly says that they were responding to a call from Brandon himself. Also interesting because Brandon's 911 call at no point mentioned Highway 277. And I just want to make sure there's no ambiguity here. They knew by December 22nd that Brandon had called first. So this is just a lie. But then on another platform, sometime before October of 2015, Melinda thought it would be a great idea to tell someone that, with regard to Brandon's condition at the time, she was told he couldn't have gone more than 100 yards. Presumably, this information came from Deputy Neal, who at no point had ever interacted with Brandon. Brandon had, of course, driven 30 miles just prior to disappearing, and searches had been conducted in the immediate vicinity of the truck prior to her interviewing anyone. He was not within 100 yards, he had not come back for his truck, and he had not turned up anywhere. Either something tragic happened to him after he left the vehicle and called 911, or he hitchhiked off of a highway so underused that Deputy Neal himself said a person could probably lie down in the middle of the road and not worry about being run over. And yet, here Melinda McCutcheon was, using her position as publisher of the local newspaper and wife of the county sheriff, to argue it was the latter, despite being fully aware that Brandon called 911 to beg for help as he believed someone was chasing him. As it would turn out, she could not possibly have been more wrong. Sadly, for almost a decade after Brandon's disappearance, and in spite of both volunteer and private search efforts, no new information came to light. The area was searched with dogs multiple times, more air hours were logged, and Texas EquiSearch scoured the surrounding properties on horseback. Then, finally, in 2022, a group led by a former classmate of Brandon's by the name of Jason Watts made a massive discovery. Now, I'll be honest, I had only 2 days to write this entire video, so in order to save myself some time and give a creator whose work I appreciate a shout out, I asked Bert from Local Legends with Bert and Moran to do a quick segment covering the first real break in the Brandon Lawson case.
First, I would like to thank the Lower Lodge for inviting me on to talk about the Brandon Lawson case. Now, going back to 2022, a search party got ready to set out on foot into the area next to Highway 277. Up to this point, flyovers had been done of the area, but due to the fact no one had permission from the landowners, no foot searches were done in this particular area. And the flyovers turned up nothing. But honestly, looking at how thick the trees, bushes, and cacti are in the area, it's no surprise that Brandon was missed. One member of this search party was a man named Jason Watts. Jason had actually been to this area multiple times before looking for Brandon. Jason was also the one who figured out who owned the land next to Highway 277. He wrote them a letter explaining who he was and what he was doing, requesting permission to search their land for any signs of Brandon. And 1 week later, Jason received a phone call from the landowner, who immediately gave him and his team permission to search the area. So, on January 15th, 2022, a 10-person search party set out on foot into the land next to Highway 277. And not terribly long into their search, they came across a pair of shoes and shorts that matched the ones Brandon was wearing the night he went missing. So, at around 3:30, 3:45, they would call law enforcement. Now, being January, by the time the police had actually arrived on the scene, the sun was starting to set, and it would actually take a couple of days for law enforcement to put together a professional search team to comb the area. But whenever they did, they came across human remains in the same general area that the initial search party found those clothes. Something to think about with these remains is that they had been out in the elements this entire time. Plus, this is Texas, and it's known to get extremely hot, not to mention that Brandon went missing in 2013, and now it's 2022. Honestly, it's lucky that any remains were found at all. The remains were sent off for testing, and on October 30th, 2023, a post was made to the Help Find Brandon Lawson Facebook page with an update about the DNA recovered from the remains. Now, there was not enough evidence to 100% confirm that it was, in fact, Brandon. There was enough evidence to confirm that the remains are male. Again, I wanted to give a thank you to the Lower Lodge for inviting me on to talk about the Brandon Lawson case.
As of October 2024, there has been no further movement on the DNA identification, which is a little bit strange considering that law enforcement told the family in March of this very year that the preliminary results had come through and they were now rerunning the tests in order to confirm their findings. That said, it is fully expected that the remains will be confirmed as being those of Brandon Lawson. This is largely due to the fact that the clothes found with the remains matched those Brandon was wearing the night he disappeared, and all of this was found within a mile of where his pickup truck was. Even if they do turn out to be his, however, that doesn't really answer any of the big questions surrounding this case. Most important among them, what precisely happened to Brandon that night on Route 277? There have been a number of hypotheses put forward, and a number of people have pointed to similarities with the disappearance of Brandon Swanson in Minnesota in 2009. Because beyond their strikingly similar names, these two cases do have quite a few similar details. For those who haven't seen our full video on Brandon Swanson, the basic gist of this case was that Brandon was leaving a party, I think something like 30 miles from his home. It's been a little while since I looked at it. But it should have been a straight shot. He just had to hop onto the highway and drive southeast and he would get home. But Swanson, much like Lawson, didn't want to get caught by the police because he had a DUI and he was underage and he was once again slightly under the influence while driving. He ended up taking a different route along a dark, seldom used rural road, went off the road, called his dad, tried to figure out where he was, and then went missing just after saying, "Oh shit," and then the phone call just done. I mean, the phone was still on, but Brandon wasn't talking. During that phone call, though, he had told his father that he believed he saw the lights of a town called Lind in the distance. Problem is, his car was nowhere near Lind. In fact, it was actually north of a highway that Lind was south of. The very same highway that Brandon should have been driving on that night. That seems though it could bear some similarity to Brandon Lawson believing that people were heading in the direction of Abilene, even though they were headed towards Bronte. Like I said, however, in order to get to Abilene, he had to continue going towards Bronte, so that could have just been that. But aside from possible misidentification of the location he was in, they also share the phone call suddenly cutting off, driving along a desolate road at night, the car being found slightly off the road in a way that didn't really make sense, the possibility of impairment, because there was the suggestion that Brandon Lawson may have been on something, and then, of course, the fact that there was nothing but farmhouses and open land for miles. But even with all those details, there's no real way to show a concrete connection between these two cases. So what else could it have been? As it turns out, the answer may lie in a little-known 2019 interview with Kyle Lawson, conducted by a small YouTube channel and podcast called Crawlspace. I say little known because at the time of recording this video, the Crawlspace channel has less than 10,000 subscribers, and this video has only slightly more than 30,000 views. But in that discussion, Kyle clarified a massive number of details that were really only alluded to or suggested by news articles, most of which failed to cite where various snippets of information actually came from. For example, Brandon Lawson's previous incarceration went unexplained in the mainstream coverage, even though Kyle himself was perfectly willing to confirm that his brother had gone to prison for delivery of marijuana to an undercover informant. Which I must say is an absolutely pathetic reason to deprive 4 children of precious time with and resources provided by their dad. As it turns out, when Brandon was released from that stint in jail, he actually was not even informed about this other warrant. He only found out when he went to renew a driver's license, or at least that's what Kyle said. Ledessa suggested that they were buying a car, but anyway, those are close enough that I don't think that's necessarily indicative of somebody lying. But point is, he only found out when he went to go do something else, and he was pretty sure that he did not commit this crime. Once again, the warrant was for possession with intent to distribute. According to Kyle, Brandon felt like this warrant was totally bogus, and he was saving up to hire a lawyer so that he could go and fight it. And with regard to the night in question, Kyle did not hold back. Speaking to the hosts of Crawlspace and reading from a personal statement, he said that it all started 2 days before Brandon went missing. I was on my way to work, Kyle explained, and my brother called me, and he was wanting to know if I could get some dope for him because he switched jobs and he'd already taken his drug test, so he wanted to get high. Kyle attempted to talk him out of it, but sensing that he wouldn't be successful, he opted for the damage control route and told Brandon to talk to a coworker of theirs named Chris. This way, at least he'd know what Brandon was getting and where it came from. After this, Brandon went and picked up Chris, who took him somewhere to buy the drugs. They proceeded to do what one does with substances, in this case methamphetamine, and then Kyle didn't hear anything for a while. Eventually, on his way home from work that day, Kyle would call Brandon and ask where he was and if he was still going to come by when Kyle got home, to which Brandon replied that he would. That never happened, and after calling around to try and figure out where the guy was, Kyle eventually tracked his brother down to a friend's house, apparently in Fort Worth. I could just be misunderstanding what Kyle was saying here, but he said he was calling friends, called friends in Fort Worth, and then he found Brandon. He might have meant that he found Brandon closer by and that he wasn't in Fort Worth, but the way that it was written, said, I suppose, it really sounded like Brandon was in Fort Worth, which again is like 3.5 hours away from his home. Either way, Kyle explained that he got on the phone and spoke to me and said he was going to be heading home soon. So I told him, okay, I'll hit you up whenever I get home from work. He said, okay, everything was normal. Later that day, which would have been Thursday, August 8th, 2013, as Kyle drove home from work, Brandon called him to say that he was on his way home and expressed concern that Ledessa better not have touched none of his stuff. Kyle, being the quick thinker that he is, drove over to his brother's house to make sure that there wouldn't be any issues and that he'd be able to intervene if there were. When he arrived, he recalled that Ledessa was cleaning the house and everything was normal. So he called Brandon and he had the couple talk to one another over the phone in order to try and smooth things over before he got home. They were arguing, Kyle said, but I didn't pay no mind to it. That would suggest to me, given the proximity and how close these families were, that this argument didn't seem like it was out of the ordinary for them. Like, it didn't seem like it was particularly bad. So Kyle returned to his own home, got ready to eat dinner, and then just as he was sitting down, he got a call from their mother. During that call, she asked him to please go over to Brandon's house and calm him down because he's flipping out. It was as he was on his way over to his brother's house that Kyle says Brandon called him and told him that Ledessa had some Mexicans from the neighborhood chasing him out of town. Brandon then elaborated that a state trooper had pulled one of them over, but there were still 2 chasing him. This was the point at which Kyle asked Brandon if he was on any substances, and the older brother adamantly insisted that he was sober before hanging up and then promptly calling back. On the second call, he told Kyle that he was about to run out of gas and he needed his brother to come and meet him with a gas can. This, of course, was convenient because Kyle was already headed over to Brandon's house. I will say there are some aspects of that point in the interview where it sounds like maybe Kyle had to go over to the house twice, but it's hard to tell exactly when these phone calls happened. But when he arrived at Brandon's house just minutes later, all Ledessa would tell him was that her husband was tripping and flipping out. But she gave Kyle the gas can and he headed home to pick up his family and go off to find his brother. I do think it's important to mention that tripping and flipping out, it's not clear. I have not heard the term tripping used to describe meth highs. My guess here would be that tripping in this case was tripping in the slang sense of the term, meaning that, somebody who just was behaving oddly. But clearly there was some possibility in Kyle's mind, possibly in Ledessa's mind, that Brandon was under the influence at the time. As Kyle drove out to find his brother, Brandon called several times, but each time Kyle says he would say a few words and hang up. Kyle told Crawlspace that the first call was to ask where he was and tell him to hurry up, while the next one was to inform Kyle and his wife, Aubrey, that he was bleeding. And the third was to once again ask where they were, to which Kyle responded that they were just about to pull up. Now, it also might be important to mention that the San Angelo Times and a lot of the various coverage say that the last thing Brandon said was, "I'm bleeding." This was also, 6 years after the fact, and a traumatic incident. Kyle might have just been remembering things out of order. In fact, he even said as much on a few occasions in this interview. He's like, I believe this is what I remember. Kyle even said as much, about the phone calls specifically, that he couldn't necessarily remember what calls gave what information when. In any case, Kyle pulled up around 1:10 a.m. on August 9th, 2013, did a U-turn, and parked on the road opposite his brother's truck. At this point, he said that Brandon called him once again. He asked Brandon where he was, to which Brandon responded that he was right there and he could see him. Before anything else could happen, however, Brandon saw Deputy Neal's headlights approaching from the north and shouted, "One time, run." Kyle revealed later in the interview, upon further questioning, that this was a code phrase in which "one time" specified that the cops were approaching. So this was not out of the ordinary. This was just his brother using language that they understood. The next thing Brandon said, on the other hand, caught his brother off guard. As Kyle told Brandon that he wasn't going to run because he'd done nothing wrong and there was therefore no reason to, Brandon told him, or asked him, I should say, "Where is your pride, mother effer?" and hung up. At this time, Kyle continued, the officer was walking up from behind his truck and he says, "Is this your truck?" I told him no, it's my brother's truck, and that he had run out of gas and he was walking down the road. In order to get away from the police so that he could hopefully coax Brandon out of the brush, he asked Neal if it was all right for him to drive a bit towards Bronte to look for him, only for Neal to tell him that he wasn't back that way. He'd just come that direction and hadn't seen anything. Regardless, and unaware that Brandon had called 911 himself just 20 minutes prior, Kyle and Audrey proceeded to drive a short way down the street before stopping and once again trying to reach Brandon. This time, he didn't respond. So after this, with a young, hungry child and a very tired girlfriend in the car with him, Kyle decided to head back home to San Angelo to pick up food for his son and get gas for his own car. I don't believe that Kyle's interview included the detail that he tried to buy gas before leaving San Angelo and then figured his brother would just be able to do it. I think that came from the San Angelo Times report, but I can't be positive. I believe the explanation here was that his direct deposit check had not cleared yet when he went to try and buy the gas the first time, but then the next morning when he went to buy gas, the money was in the account. Again, there's a lot of contradictory details between the varying stories here that don't seem to have any corroborable evidence. Either way, after getting all of that handled, Kyle went to pick up a friend named Chris, who it appears may have been the same Chris that sold Brandon the drugs in the first place. By the time they made it back to Brandon's pickup, fully expecting he'd just be hanging out somewhere nearby, Deputy Neal was gone and the vehicle had been locked with the blinkers turned on. "So we drove down the road very slow," Kyle continued, hollering and screaming his name out, and he would never come. "So I went down to the gas station and parked on the side, while Audrey got out, got the gas can out of the trunk, and went and put $5 in the gas can, and then I drove back down to my brother's truck, and I got out, and I put the gas in his truck, and I yelled out, 'Gas in your truck, bro, the law's gone, get in it and go.' But Brandon didn't show." Confused, he says that they drove up and down 277 for about an hour shouting for him, but there remained no sign of Brandon. Finally, after the pickup was towed, Ledessa called the sheriff to let them know what was going on. Unfortunately, because Kyle had been cagey with Deputy Neal the night before, he says the police treated him like he was lying to them about everything just because he didn't tell them that night that his brother had a felony warrant and was hiding in the woods. Had he known about the 911 call, he told Crawlspace, he would have just told them the truth off the bat. But without knowing and thinking his brother was just having a bad experience with drugs, he obviously wasn't going to snitch and potentially send Brandon back to jail. Later, in the course of the investigation, Kyle was brought in and questioned. The Coke County Sheriff's Office and the Texas Ranger wanted me to come in for an interview, he recalled, because they seemed to think that I just picked my brother up and gave him a ride that night and dropped him off. Adamant that he had nothing to do with his brother's disappearance and concerned that Brandon met with foul play that night, Kyle then requested a polygraph. The investigators said sure, and they asked two primary questions. The first was if he'd given Brandon a ride and if he'd had any contact since, to which he said no. Then they asked if he'd done something to harm Brandon, and once again he said no, and he ended up passing both tests. Now, polygraph tests are really only useful as an investigative tool. They don't hold up in court. They're pretty inaccurate. For the most part, they're a good psychological tool to be able to tell if somebody's sweating. Essentially, they are a supplemental investigative tool, not a primary one. Anyway, throughout the interview, Kyle remained steadfast on two things. His brother did not just get high and end up dying of exposure, and that Brandon would not abandon his family for any reason. As for the 911 call, he does have some ideas. For one, he's confident that the unintelligible words spoken during the call, which sounds like scaper or staper, was an attempt to say state trooper that was muddled by panic, or that the recording itself had been altered by the police. It can be assumed that this is because Brandon told him directly that it was a state trooper during their phone call. There also is a strange sound in there that some people have suggested might have been gunshots, but Kyle says that that's actually the sound that the bridge over the Colorado River makes when a vehicle drives over it if you're under that bridge. So this would suggest that he believed Brandon was hiding under the Route 277 bridge over the Colorado River, about a mile north of the pickup truck. The part he can't wrap his head around is the same thing that's been confusing everyone else for the last 11 years. Why did Brandon call 911 and specifically request the cops, only to hide from police when they showed up 20 minutes later? Furthermore, why did he tell his brother to run when Kyle had no reason to be concerned about an interaction with an officer? And I'm not asking that like Kyle didn't do anything wrong. What could possibly happen? Kyle himself said that he had nothing to worry about and he was not concerned. I mean, to kind of wrap it all up in a bow, what happened to him in that 20-minute period that could have caused him to suddenly develop an intense fear of the very people he had just called for help? Could it have anything to do with Brandon's claim that a state trooper had pulled over whoever he believed was chasing him? And in direct relation to that point, who did he mistake for a state trooper given that none were in the area that night? Asked what he believed happened, Kyle gave two very direct and explicit answers. There has been foul play, he told Crawlspace. Either that, or that police officer killed my brother. It's now been 5 years since that interview, and aside from remains that are probably Brandon's turning up a mile away from where the truck was, nothing's really come out. I think part of the reason this case is so frustrating overall is the fact that nobody's stories match 100%. Obviously, the Observer Enterprise, there are no words for how unprofessional and unethical their coverage was. I mean, the wife of the sheriff writing the articles and the posts she did, basically almost using the Facebook page of what is supposed to be the local paper as a gossip column, that is unforgivable and unacceptable. On the other hand, Ledessa and Kyle's stories don't totally line up. Now, granted, Ledessa gave her interview about a year after everything happened, and there had been some preliminary conversations. It seemed like she might have had the data more right in front of her. Kyle gave his 6 years later, but he also prepared a written statement. Still, a number of the answers that Kyle gave during his interviews were off the cuff and not part of the written statement, so that could account for some of it. What I would look at is the stuff in the written statement, which is things like him saying that he was on his way over to Ledessa's when he got the phone call from Brandon, but then he seems to imply that he got a second phone call from Brandon after leaving Ledessa's, but the way it's phrased, it sounds like it was on the way over the first time. Like I said, it's just a little confusing. It could just be that this is a guy who that's just how he writes, and he was writing how he remembered, and something got garbled a little bit. And while it seems that Ledessa and Kyle both believe that foul play probably had something to do with this, it's not just the sheriff's office of Cook County that argues it wasn't. Currently, Jason Watts, the guy who actually found the remains, or at least led the party that found the remains, in an interview with John Lorden, I believe, probably, that sounds right. In that interview, he seemed to be saying that he doesn't think this was foul play, at least as the evidence currently stands. Now, really, there are a couple of possibilities here. Either somebody did something to Brandon, or Brandon was on drugs, but Kyle was pretty clear during his interview that not only did Brandon adamantly deny being on anything, but he also had never hallucinated while on meth, at least so far as Kyle was aware. If it wasn't drugs, it kind of almost has to be foul play, because the only things that really explain Brandon's behavior that night are drugs and him being chased. Now, one thing that does seem possible to me is that Brandon was on drugs and that it also wasn't a hallucination, and that as he was leaving San Angelo, people were behind him. For some reason, he got the idea that he was being chased. One of them got pulled over by a state trooper, before reaching Cook County, and then the others ran from the state trooper, and he thought they were still chasing him. He ran out of gas on the side of the road, swerved a little bit, and, ended up where he did. But would they be chasing him that far? There were turnoffs. There were actually not a lot, but there were several turnoffs. Then again, why turn off? It's much easier to go very, very fast and try and get away from the cops on a straightaway, and 277 sure is a straightaway. I do think that may be the most likely one here, that Brandon was just paranoid, that people were behind him, maybe street racing or something. Somebody got pulled over, the other two ran, they were behind him, he thought he was being chased, and he ended up out of gas. But then what about the thing in the field? Like, there are ways to explain the lead up to the actual disappearance, but the disappearance itself is really confusing. I think that the real strange part of this, in all of the other strange parts, has to be him calling the cops and then running from the cops. I can't put that one together in my head. Maybe it's drugs, but if you listen to the phone call, he sounds scared. So for him to be scared and running he sounds like he's running during the phone call. He's out of breath. And Kyle said that it sounded like Brandon was running while he was on the phone with him. So how do you go from being running in terror and calling the police, and then 20 minutes later, you're perfectly calm, sitting by the side of the road, avoiding the cops? I don't know. I mean, that's kind of where Kyle's opinion would come in here, that a police officer did something to him, and that's why he was running again. But then again, it could possibly have been the drugs. I personally don't know. I am going to do a little bit more digging into this case and into that sheriff's department, because I'm curious. Some things about this whole investigation felt a little off, and especially Melinda McCutcheon. As far as I'm aware, the people involved in this are no longer with the department, so that's not necessarily a problem now. But I think it still bears, it could still be investigated. That matters. So I'm going to give that a look. I might submit a FOIA request to try and get a hold of the police report, the documents, all of that, and then take another look at this. Maybe I'll have Bert on to discuss it on the live show. And speaking of the live show, that is something that we do every Monday night at 7 p.m. unless we don't, but if we don't, we always tell you ahead of time. This just seems like a good time to segue into the outro of the show, wherein I tell you that, once again, if you'd like to wear the Lodge, if you'd like to support what we do, help us out do more work, and hopefully grow so that we can do more on-the-ground stuff and more interviews in person, then you can go to bunkerbranding.com and you can buy this hoodie. You can buy the two hoodies or the hoodie, I guess it was one design, two girls. You can buy the hoodie that they were wearing. You can get the Redacted Media shirt Aiden was wearing, and both this hoodie and those hoodies actually come as t-shirts as well. Additionally, we have a Lift Lodge t-shirt, which is basically this exact same design, but the deer has a barbell in its mouth. You can also support us by drinking the Lodge. You can do that by going to tableauroastingco.com and purchasing our coffee Mount Pocono perk, or our collaboration with Stakuyi/History of Everything, which gets you both ours, his Lewis and Dark, and mugs with each channel's logo on them. Matt Moore down at Tableau is a wizard when it comes to coffee. It is the coffee I drink every day, and not just because I get it for free. You can also support us very directly by subscribing to our Patreon. We are currently working on bringing something new over that, but we're not sure quite what it's going to be yet. It might be me having you guys submit stories about your weird experiences and diagnosing what might have happened. Sort of a house MD of the unsolved and paranormal. You can join Patreon for just $1 a month, and we will be bringing back Liquor Lore very soon. We just have not had any time to be drunk. And the times we have had time to be drunk were not good times to film. If you would like to support us by simply watching more Lodge, then you can do that by going to the Weird Bible. You can do that by going to the History Hut, my personal channel, Aiden Mattis. All of those have their own content, and as I mentioned earlier, History Hut is in fact going to be getting its own new podcast with Roman Helmet Guy and History of Everything. It's going to have a new name, but currently the channel is the History Hut. If you want to help us out by getting that channel monetized, just watch our videos that we have up there. We just need I think we need like a couple thousand more hours. But that show will be launching in January? January. If you'd like to help us out algorithmically, you can give us some name ideas in the comments. And also helping us algorithmically would be liking this video, sharing it, just letting people know about the Lodge. The most helpful thing you can do for us is share this channel with 5 other people. If the Lodge grows, the Lodge gets more views, we're able to do more cool stuff. Like next year I want to drive a Jeep Gladiator to follow the Donner Party. I need to buy that Gladiator. Last but not least, I don't think I forgot anything else, we have Discord. Our Discord is at bit.ly/jointhelodge, and that is the absolute best place to interact with other fans of the show, get important updates on what's going on, and occasionally, Aiden and I hang out in there either in a voice chat, or we just pop in to do some messaging in the general. So, if you want to join that, it's bit.ly/jointhelodge. I think it's a great time, and yeah, I think that just about covers everything. I'm Aiden Madison. Thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.